Hello everybody, Marc Buyse. Nice to have you on this webinar, and the webinar, as you know, will be on implementation of adaptive designs, operational challenges. I will start the webinar with a general introduction, and then Linda Danielson will discuss a case study, and I will close the seminar with some conclusions. So perhaps the best way to start is to define what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about adaptive designs, and these are defined in the FDA draft guidance on adaptive design clinical trials as a study that includes a prospectively planned opportunity for modification of one or more of the study design features based on analysis of usually interim data from subjects in the study. In some rare cases, the adaptation can occur at the time that the final analysis of the trial would have taken place, but this has to be prospectively defined. So adaptive designs indeed use the accumulating data from the trial itself to adapt design features, and those include, and we will get back to this, the choice of a dose, the sample size, the interim analysis plan, the patient population, the primary endpoint, etc. As a matter of fact, recently, statistical theory has evolved in such a way that the major requirement of adaptive designs, which is that the alpha level or the type 1 error level be preserved. This is the main concern that the regulatory agencies have, that whatever adaptation you do not inflate the type 1 error, and that needs to be preserved at 5% usually, or less than 5%. Now, this problem is solved statistically. We now have methods that allow the alpha level to be preserved, whatever the adaptations, even very complex adaptations can take place, and yet the alpha level is preserved. And so we believe that attention should focus more on the logistics and interpretation of the results of adapted trials rather than on the alpha level preservation, which is now well known. So we won't discuss methods to preserve the alpha level today. What we will discuss instead is really the logistical and practical aspects of implementing adaptive designs. Before we go into the case study, I wanted to discuss the kinds of design features that can be adapted in an adaptive design. So I've listed here the main design features of a trial, and obviously these design features include the treatment, which is under investigation, and the control group, the randomization ratio between these two options, sometimes more options than two, the treatment effect that is anticipated, and of course therefore the sample size of the trial that is based on that treatment effect of interest, the population of patients who need to be entered in the trial, the type 1 and type 2 error rates, the primary endpoint, the timing of the analysis, the primary statistical test, and the schedule of patient evaluations. Now, of all these design features, the most commonly adapted are the treatment itself in dose-finding trials. And we will discuss a case study of a dose-finding trial, a phase 1 trial in oncology. The randomization ratio can be changed adaptively, and that is done through adaptive randomization. The sample size is commonly increased in adaptive designs, and so we will very briefly touch on sample size increases. And finally, the population which is entered in the trial can be changed in an adaptive fashion, and that is done in enrichment design trials. If we look at the phases of development that are implicated by these changes, the dose-finding trial would actually be relevant in phase 1 and phase 2 situations. The adaptive randomization trials usually concern phase 2 trials, and then the sample size increase and the enrichment design typically would bear on phase 3 designs. Now, as I said, we will discuss today a very specific case study because we felt that it would be easier to discuss implementation issues if we were talking about an actual trial rather than in general. And the case study that we will actually look at is a phase 1 clinical trial. Before we move to the case study, perhaps a few generalities of why adaptive designs can be useful. Adaptive designs can be useful to handle uncertainty. It's fair to say that when you start a clinical development, particularly in phase 1 and even phase 2, there is so much uncertainty about the effects of the drug that it may be useful to adapt with some data at hand. And so we think that adaptive designs have a particularly interesting place in phase 1 designs, and that's why we chose this example of a phase 1 trial that uses an adaptive design rather than a fixed design. There is a need for flexibility in clinical trials. For example, it may be efficient to start several doses or several schedules of a treatment and to drop those that seem to be less efficacious, and this would be typically done in phase 2. Limited financial resources is another reason why adaptive designs are very actively studied. And this is particularly true of biotech companies who may not have the resources to do a large-scale phase 3 trial, but who may have the resources to do a modestly sized phase 2 that might actually lead into a phase 3. In that case, it is sometimes interesting to start a randomized phase 2 trial that is continued as a phase 3, rather than to do a phase 2 trial which is then stopped and then the phase 3 trial has to be started afterwards. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we live in a fast-moving environment. New drugs get developed, new treatments get implemented or approved, and therefore for any trial of long duration, it's very useful to have the possibility of adapting the design of a trial given the changing environment. And that is sometimes done in phase 3 trials. So these are the main reasons why adaptive designs attract so much interest. And in spite of all these interests, the use of adaptive designs is actually quite modest. And why is that? We will get back to this actually towards the end of the presentation, but for now, I think the main reasons why adaptive designs haven't been used as much as they could have, and the reasons for that lack of interest, in a sense, are listed here. Actual gains from adaptive designs, in fairness, are generally small, so you shouldn't expect that the adaptive design will completely revolutionize the way in which drugs get developed. They are very useful to optimize drug development, but they won't change fundamentally the drug development paradigm that we've all been operating in. The theory of adaptive designs was until recently not so widely understood. I think it's fair to say that today there are enough fundamental publications on adaptive designs that the basic problems of them have all been addressed statistically. Sometimes people feel that an adaptive design is not as credible as a fixed sample design, and that may be true unless the adaptive design is completely controlled, completely pre-specified, and well executed.